Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Viltrox Autofocus 33mm F1.4. Now, I'm reviewing it on a Fuji XF mount, and I do believe that there will be a Sony APS-C E-mount version that is coming. Right now, this is what is available for. So this gives you a wide aperture 50mm equivalent, and the full frame equivalent of this lens is a 50mm lens. So your angle of view is going to be what is like right in the range of what we would call a normal angle of view. So obviously a very versatile, useful kind of lens, and of course with a wider maximum aperture than what the less expensive Fuji alternative. So Fuji has two 35mm options. There's the 35mm f2, there's a 35mm f1.4. The f2 clocks in at about $399 US or $400. The f1.4 version clocks in at around $600 US. So at $280 US, this obviously undercuts both of those in price. And so it gives you an option if you really want a brighter f1.4 maximum aperture. It gives you some options when it comes to that. So I will note that this is a really beautifully executed lens in terms of the package. We'll explore that more in a moment. It has a nice compact size. It's a beautiful pairing. It looks great on the XT4 body that I did the review on. But today we're going to determine whether or not it is a viable alternative to either of those Fuji lenses and whether or not it should be seriously considered. So let's jump in and explore whether or not this is a lens you should seriously consider if you are a Fuji shooter. Let's look at the build and the handling first and dive in for a closer look at this lens. So as we can see, this lens is a beautiful fit on a body like the new Fuji XT4. And in terms of its size and its dimensions, it's really fantastic. And Viltrox is doing an amazing job of refining their lens design. And I'm really quite shocked at how feature-rich this little lens is. First of all, it does have a bayonet-style tulip lens hood, but this is an incredibly premium lens hood. It's actually made out of metal, fine ribs inside, and it is really nice. And the advantage over a lot of metal lens hoods is that, of course, it can reverse really tightly on there for storage, helping the footprint for the lens to remain very, very small. So kudos to them on that. It's definitely a step above anything I've seen from Viltrox in terms of the lens hood, and the design of this lens is really fantastic. So up front, you can see that we have a 52mm front filter thread, minimum focus distance of 0.4 meters or 1.31 feet. The magnification is, a fairly pedestrian average 0.14, 0.15 times range. Basically what you would expect to get from a typical 55mm lens. A maximum aperture of f1.4. We have got 9 rounded aperture blades there. And what is fairly unique for a third-party lens here on Fuji is the fact that you do have the kind of dual mode aperture ring. Now in this case it is a declicked aperture ring, and it's electronic, and so as you can see nothing is happening inside while I rotate the ring. However, it's connected to the camera that will control that. So you have 1/3 stop detents that are kind of shown here, but they're not hard detents. Nothing stops, and so they're just this actual aperture markings. Or you can switch it into automatic mode as well. As far as any other features, there is no weather sealing that is mentioned, and none that I can discern here. But what the Viltrox does do that I really like is they include a micro USB port in the actual lens itself here at the lens mount. And so once you figure out how to do their firmware updates, which I will say Viltrox can do a better job of putting instructions right there, and so you can easily update firmware on there. The actual process is not difficult, but you have to go searching for a while if you don't know how to do it because the instructions are not very clear. But being able to do a firmware update without any other accessory required, no dock, no need to use the camera to do it, is really a great process, and you can update firmware literally within seconds on it. So I am impressed with that inclusion as well. Our construction grade here is actually really great. I mean, this feels like a premium lens, even though it's only priced at $279. And so what we have is a weight of 270 grams. You know, it's a little heavier than what it looks, mostly because of such a nice grade of construction, or 9.52 ounces in terms of the weight. Our physical dimensions here are 65 millimeters in diameter by 72 millimeters in length. And so as you can see, nice and compact, and really high marks here for the grade of build. The focus ring is nicely damped. This is a really nicely made lens and belies the inexpensive price and the relatively unknown third-party status of Viltrox, though I suspect we'll become much more familiar with the name moving ahead. Let's talk about autofocus for a moment, because autofocus obviously is a key component. What Viltrox has done is they have managed to fairly successfully do autofocus on Fuji and on Sony, actually, for that matter. Now, what I've found overall is that autofocus here is quite good. It is fast, it's quiet, no problems with that. And I've had really quite a good autofocus performance. IEF has worked well. It's done good even for dimmer lit family type situations, and picking up and detecting the eye and making sure to accurately focus on them. Now, as far as the focus pulls for video work, which I will note, I've never yet been fully impressed by Fuji's performance in this aspect. I feel like they have lagged significantly behind either Canon or Sony, the other two platforms I'm most familiar with in this regard. There is some progress on the X-T4. I don't think it's quite there, but I will note that the Viltrox feels just a little bit sloppy, and you'll see why. Let's take a look at this clip. You can see that while speed is not a problem there's just a little bit of sloppiness when arriving at the destination. It's a little bit of an overshoot sometimes, and a little bit of a pulse to grab the right degree of focus. The actual focus motor is fairly quiet, so not a problem there, but it's just not the most refined view that I've looked. Now, a plus that over what I have seen, including on the 35mm F2 from Fuji, is that I really noted some stepping action with the focus motor, and that was on the X-T3, not the X-T4, by the way. But certainly compared to that, there's less of that visible stepping. There is a faster progression back and forth, just still a little bit sloppy on the actual settling on correct focus. But overall, I'm going to give the focus motor, a 7 or 8 out of 10 type rating. It does a good job. It is quiet, and IAF has worked well. I could just like to see maybe a little bit better performance when it comes to the video focus. Maybe that's something they can continue to refine via firmware. So let's talk about the overall image quality. We're going to dive in and take a close look at what you are getting in this particular lens. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see, there is definitely some pincushion distortion here. Fairly linear. You can see my manual correction. It comes out pretty well. There is a tiny bit of a bulge in this zone to where there's just maybe a little aspect where there's a little bit of a wave pattern there. Not, as you can see, majorly disruptive there, and everything corrects pretty cleanly. I used a -5 on the distortion to correct things and a +33 for the vignette. Pulled the midpoint over, and as you can see, we've got a nice even illumination left over. Now, if you compare F1.4 to F2, you can see that there is a mild vignette lift. However, it's not a significant one. You're going to have to stop on down to F2.8 and F4 to really eliminate all the vignette. This lens does suffer with some longitudinal chromatic aberrations. As you can see here, there is both some purple fringing before the plane of focus, some green fringing afterward. That does give us some reduced contrast. As you can see, it's not as inky black as what we would like to see at the plane of focus. This can be seen in the real world. You can see a fair bit of this kind of aqua blue-green fringing that is taking place in some of the defocused area. And while this looks pretty yummy here, you can also see that we've got some reduced contrast on some of the textures, some surface blur that is due to the various aberrations that are here. Likewise here on these high contrast subjects, before the plane of focus, you can see some fringing and kind of some bleeding, not greatly defined edges, and green fringing after the plane of focus into the bokeh region. And so, you know, high contrast and chromatic aberration control, not necessarily a strength for the lens. At a medium distance here, we can see that the purple fringing is actually not as bad in this. Lighting maybe a little bit less harsh, but what we can see is definitely the fringing on the bokeh region is going to persist. You know, viewed globally, in this image, it's not incredibly destructive, but just something to note. So taking a look at our resolution, we've already seen that contrast, not necessarily a strength. And so at f1.4, contrast is pretty soft. Resolution is not particularly profound here. This is on the new XT4 body. And so as you can see, resolution, there is an uptick in resolution and some better contrast to be found at f1.8. Looking at the middle, you know, everything's a little bit mushy here, not great defined. And down into the corner, we can see really quite soft in the corners at f1.4 and only a mild improvement at f1.8. Stopping on down to f2 increases the contrast. However, there's still not a lot of corner resolution. So we move on to f2.8, where you're getting a little improvement, still not fantastic. Moving back up to our mid-frame, we can see mid-frame is starting to look fairly good now. And if we go back to center of the frame, now center of the frame is looking fairly crisp here with good contrast and much better resolution. We can see better performance at f4 and f5.6. Mid-frame by f5.6 is now looking fairly excellent, good strong performance there. And our corners are finally at f5.6 starting to look fairly good. Not fantastic, but fairly good, credible at this point. We see just a hair more at f8 before diffraction starts to kick in. We can see at f11 that we haven't gained any more, diffraction has started, but at the same time it still looks pretty decent. And by f16, you can tell that it is a little bit softer compared to f11, and that's due mostly to diffraction. And you can see there's been a drop here as well on the textures in the mid-frame. Here's an image at f4 out in the woods. And here, this is a pretty decent result here. Again, it's not high-end razor sharp. You can see some lateral chromatic aberrations up here. But overall, I mean, it's certainly sharp enough to be, you know, nice and credible, so not a bad end result there. Now, here's a look at our minimum focus and maximum magnification, which is fairly pedestrian, probably somewhere in the 0.14 range, so not fantastic. And on the left at f1.4, you can see that low contrast is kind of robbing textures of pop. However, if you stop down to f2.8, you can see a pretty dramatic improvement on now everything looks quite good here at minimum focus. So taking a quick look at our bokeh, and the bokeh quality is okay. Again, it's not exceptional. I find that there is too much of the outlining to make it truly soft, even at f1.4. Taking a look at the foreground bokeh, and again, it is only average at best. And if we jump in, for example, here on the right side, you can see that that low contrast is keeping this image from really popping. You can just see there's some surface blur haze on textures here as well. I find the color from the lens to be fairly good. However, you know, you can see that on this type of image, that bit of haze and softness on textures keeps the image from looking really great at a pixel level. Now at f2, we're looking here at how that IAF has worked for just kind of like general purpose, you know, around the house, shooting events, in this case my birthday, and you can see that IAF worked fine. The focus is good. Again, it's not razor sharp, but it is nailed focus. And here, kind of a downward tilt to the eyes. You can see also IAF is grabbed on appropriately. And one final shot here, you can see again, kind of the even though the hair is shading the eye, you can see that focus is grabbed on accurately. And finally, we'll take a look at a flare. There's definitely some veiling if the sun is around and in the frame. You can see some loss of contrast there. We've got some ghosting artifact patterns that are showing up here at this point. Here in this shot, you can see that there's some veiling coming down from the top. And you can see that other than some low contrast, the image looks fairly decent. That fringing on the bokeh is going to be a bit of a concern if that's something that bothers you. Finally, here with the sun just kind of right out of the frame, you can see some generalized veiling and kind of a large ghosting artifact here. And so, these are things that you have to use wisely. They can be used to artistic advantage. I think that this image is fairly artistic. You can see some of that prismatic kind of haze here. But you have to be smart about the way you compose with the lens. So I would say a mixed bag there. Definitely more chromatic aberrations than what I would like to see, and that of course does have a negative impact on, unfortunately in this case, I would say both contrast and resolution, but also bokeh. There's enough of that fringing that it does negatively impact the bokeh as well, just because there's more fringing outlining on bokeh balls or circles. And so, I'm not thrilled necessarily about that. The other problem for me when it comes to selecting this lens over what I feel is a fairly excellent lens in the 35mm f2 is that while the 35mm f2 isn't quite as feature rich in terms of maximum aperture, I would say that this Viltrox is arguably a slightly better built lens. But I found the 35mm f2 to be really, really sharp from f2 on, sharper than what this Viltrox is. And so I find it a little bit hard on an image quality side to recommend this lens over the slightly more expensive, about $120 extra going to the Fuji non-lens. And so in conclusion, I would say that is kind of where I am left. While I am delighted that this lens exists, and I'm delighted for those of you that really want a brighter option than f2, I think that this is a viable alternative to the 35mm f1.4 if you're on a tight budget. It's less than half the money, and gives you a fair bit of the performance, maybe even arguably a little bit better autofocus performance. However, where it lets me down somewhat is in the overall resolution from the lens. That I think I found Fuji's 35mm f2 to be a really excellent, arguably one of their better lenses kind of across the board for that kind of value. And so I would, if I were spending the money, I might personally still lean towards that lens. But of course your mileage may vary, and I suspect that there will be deals on this lens moving ahead that will probably allow you to get it in the $250 US range, and it's kind of hard to argue against it. As if you're looking at it from the perspective of compared to a typical nifty 50mm f1.8, it's got most of the image quality performance. I don't think as good stop down as what some of those lenses are, but it's definitely got a better build and better autofocus in many cases. So, you'll have to just take all of that into consideration. It's your money to spend, and I hope that this has helped out in helping you to make an informed decision. Now, if you would like to look at some of the photos, more than a split second here as a part of this, I recommend that you take a look at the image gallery that I will share too. There's also buying links in the description down below from a variety of options if you would like to purchase one for yourself. I'll also throw linkage there to the 35mm f2 if you want to either check out my review of that lens or if you would like to consider purchasing it instead. There's also linkage there below if you would like to follow me on social media or become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and of course if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.